Welcome, everybody. I'm Sid Melcher, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and I want to welcome you all to our fourth Instant Issues Online. Our Instant Issues series is generously sponsored by Glen Meadow, Greenfield Savings Bank, Wilbraham and Munson Academy, and Sir Speedy. And we're also pleased that, to partner with Valley Eye Radio, which will be broadcasting the audio of this event for their listeners who have low vision or print disabilities. Our speaker is going to be introduced today by Council Board Member John David Perez Sr., who is a principal at Concilium Opus, which helps underwrite our Zoom account. So he's very critical to us being able to be here today. I'm going to disappear and we'll be back in about 20-25 minutes for the Q&A. If you have questions for Javier, then please use the Q&A or comments feature. Thank you. Take it away, John David.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is John David Perez. I'm the president-elect of the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Western Mass. I would like to thank everyone that is present today in this webinar, to our Executive Director, Cynthia Melcher, for her great work scheduling and coordinating these exchanges, and to John Morse, the Board of Director President, for his leadership and all the sponsors that made this webinar possible. I'm very, very proud to introduce Dr. Javier Corrales, a fellow Puerto Rican. Dr. Corrales is a Dwight W. Morrow 1895 professor and chair of political science at Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts. He holds a bachelor's degree in foreign service for Georgetown University and obtained his PhD in political science from Harvard University. Dr. Corrales' research focuses on the democratization, presidential powers, democratic backsliding, political economic development, ruling parties, the incumbents' advantage, foreign policies, and sexuality. He has published extensively on Latin America and the Caribbean. He is the author or co-author of many books, including his latest, Fixing Democracy, Why Constitutional Change Often Fails to Enhance Democracy in Latin America, published by Oxford University Press. His research has been published in academic journals as the Comparative Politics, World Development, Political Science Quarterly, Foreign Policy, and many others. Also, he writes periodically for the New York Times. He was a visiting scholar at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University, and was Fulbright Scholar in Bogotá, Colombia, and Caracas, Venezuela. He became one of the youngest scholars ever to be selected as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholarship in Washington, D.C. He became, Dr. Corrales also had been consultant for the World Bank, the United Nations, the Center for Global Development, Freedom House, and the American Academy of Arts and Science. He was born in Puerto Rico from Cuban parents, and very proud of Dr. Javier Corrales. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Javier Corrales.
Thank you very much, John David. That were very kind words. Thank you for the invitation and for your attendance. And I hope we're getting more used to this new format. I wish I could be there in person, but this is the world that we're in. And let's be grateful that we have the technology to be able to do this, even if it's different. I'm delighted to do this. I've always said this. I've always been very impressed with this group. I didn't even know that it existed until much later in life. And now that I know, I just think that it is a treasure that we have in this country. And I want to tell you how much I admire, and I hope this is a tradition that endures into the future. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then I'm very interested in your comments and questions. Give me 1 second. Let's get this set up, and it should be 1 minute. And now, just want to make sure that you can all see the first slide, why populism is the sugar, salt, fat of our politics. Guessing everybody can see it. This is my talk for today. All right, so let me begin by saying that populism is a topic in political science that has been studied enormously, and I myself I'm unable to keep up with the literature. So it's a big topic, and I think most political scientists will tell you that we need to make a distinction between economic populism and political populism. Economic populism is when, a politician promises far more than they can deliver. And we understand that. But the most recent focus of attention is on what we may call political populism, which may involve economic populism, but not necessarily. And I want to talk about what we know about populism and to essentially discuss that populism has always been big in the global South, not that big in advanced democracies. But this is now changing. It is changing in that it remains big in the global South, but it is also becoming big in advanced democracies. And I'm going to make the point that we're currently in the United States under a politically populist administration. And I'm going to use an analogy of sugar, salt, and fat to talk about populism to see if we can understand it. Like all analogies, it is useful to a point. It doesn't work all the way, and I hope to discuss the usefulness and the limitations of the analogy. These are my 3 points for today. Just first, I want to talk a little bit about democratic backsliding. I'll tell you what that means once I get to it. Then I'm going to connect this to populism, and here's where I'm going to develop the analogy with sugar, salt, and fat. And finally, my 3rd point is I want to talk a little bit about the difference between left-wing and right-wing populism. Those are my 3 themes. Let's do them. All right, democratic backsliding. Democratic backsliding is something that is worrying a lot of political scientists. There was a time when most challenges to democracies would come from non-elected folks, actors. There's an elected government, and then folks who are not in office overthrow it, either the military or guerrillas. Democratic backsliding is the term that we're using to situations when it is the elected office holders who begin to erode the institutions of democracy. This is becoming very common, and let me show you a chart that tells you how common this is. I know it's a little busy, but let me explain to you what this is. This is a chart that is based on an index of liberal democracy, and it includes countries. And the way to read this is you have, oops, my apologies. Let me go back. And it's an index that goes from 1 to 0. And 1 means that it's a country that meets all the conditions of a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy means that you not only have elections for office, but you have the rule of law, checks and balances, and freedoms and respect for all political actors to compete. And what this chart shows is all the countries that have experienced declines. So the way to read this, think of this as stock prices dropping. So for example, the first case here is Poland, which starts out here, and this is up to 2019 and has declined in this score. So as you can see, all these countries here tended to be more or less democratic. They start differently, and they have experienced declines. We're worried about this. We are worried that this is happening to democracies that weren't that strong to begin with, but it is also happening to democracies that were scoring very high. And we're beginning to study this. So the field of political science doesn't have all the answers. Just like when we discover a new pathology in the natural sciences, we don't know the answers right away, but we are very aware that this is the new trend. Now let me show you a country that I'm going to discuss, which is Venezuela. It starts out here, which is not bad for world standards, and it has gone all the way down. It is one of the countries that has regressed the most in this picture. Let me also show you the same numbers, but plotted in a different way. It's the same index, Liberal Democracy Index, ranging from 1 to 0. And you have the evolution of Venezuela at the end of the 1950s. It experiences a transition to democracy. It stays democratic, and this is the democratic backsliding that Venezuela experienced. This runs all the way to 2018, very, very low. Let me now show you so that you get an idea how this index compares to the United States. Here is the same scores for the United States. And when Venezuela had its transition to democracy, it matched the same levels of the United States. The United States had a good run. It continued. But what I want you to notice is that we're starting to see this. And a lot of people are wondering, is this just a temporary blip, or are these similar processes? Now, they're very different countries with differences in wealth and political traditions, so don't assume necessarily that they're going to replicate their paths. But we have already seen enough of this, and of course, this has to do with the last year of the Obama administration and the first 3 years of the Trump administration. Okay, so I hope we're now comfortable with the concept of democratic backsliding. Now let me connect this to populism. The argument is a lot of these processes of democratic backsliding occur with the rise of political populism. So let's talk about populism and what this means, and I'm going to use the analogy. I don't know if you have read this book, but this is where the analogy comes from. It was a New York Times bestseller by a very good journalist, Michael Moss, from 2013, who wrote a book entitled Salt, Sugar, Fat, where he argued that a lot of our health problems and diet addiction problems have to do with changes in the food industry in the 80s. These companies hired scientists, chemists, engineers to manipulate the salt, sugar, and fat content of natural foods. So working with natural ingredients in natural food, but you just altered the salt, sugar, and fat to produce junk food. And with all the attributes of junk food, which is they are addictive. In other words, you cannot stop consuming it. They really produce a significant degree of pleasure in your brain when you eat it. And they tend to be very bad for your health, although you don't notice it right away. It's a fascinating argument and a very well-researched book. I'm here to argue that in many ways, populism is a little bit like a politician coming in and taking the salt, sugar, and fat of typical democracy and manipulate them in order to create something new. Perhaps a new type of junk food, a new type of junk democracy. with some of the attributes. So what does it mean when we talk about, I'm going to change the order, sugar, salt, and fat. Okay, the sugar. Sugar in the food industry is something that you add to make something sweeter. And this is one of the things that produces an enormous amount of pleasure in the brain. All political populists have a sugar component. And by sugar, we mean they do something that is incredibly sweet for democracy. Typically, they mobilize groups that had never had a voice in politics. So it could be rural white Americans losing jobs, or it could be low-income favela dwellers in South America, or it could be victims of crimes in the Philippines. So they all of them come to office by mobilizing folks who felt they weren't heard before, and especially ordinary folks. Almost nobody objects to this part of populism. Many people say this is what makes populism democratic, in that it comes with a mobilization of some group that has been excluded, unheard in politics. They all do this. All populists do it, and they do it in a way that is unprecedented, generally generating large electoral mobilization. And again, it's hard to say that this is bad for democracy, but this is where the problem starts to get complicated. Salt. Salt is a condiment, and one of the reasons chefs would use any type of condiment or salt is to enhance the flavor. And here's where the problem begins. Populism uses a particular aspect of democracy, which is competition for office, and adds spice to it by turning this competition into a hate game. They will talk about the opponents as traitors, anti-people, accuse them of being elitist, accuse them of being biased, accuse them of being self-serving, and in many ways, not deserving of rights. All populists do this. They are incredibly vocal in their hate speech toward the opposition. They don't treat the opposition as just your political rival in sort of like civil way, kind of like in a polite way. No, it's you have to overdo the really vicious attacks, almost to the point where you have to qualify them as non-deserving of rights or opportunities. So they are very good to their folks and very nasty to their opponents. Here's the problem with democracy, because democracy requires the winners to accept the opposition and to treat them with perhaps far more care than they should be treating their own folks. This is quintessential liberal democracy. But populism challenges this. And then fat. This is the other interesting thing. Fat is a macronutrient. And what fat does in the food industry is it packs whatever food it is with energy. It has the largest concentration of energy. In political populism, here's what I'm arguing. How fat emerges is all populists come in and they saturate the polity with a bunch of things that they want to do. They're all over the place. You cannot keep up with them. They're talking one day about one policy area and they do something else. In some countries, they change the constitution in a year. They're appointing judges left and right. They are changing regulations big time. It's multiple things that you cannot keep up with them. This is very consistent. And the reason they do this is because they want to be able to argue that they are really changing things, to capture the sentiment that you know, people want real change. They don't see it happening. This is the problem with liberal democracy. Change is slow. They need to compete with that. And so we need to demonstrate that we are attacking every possible front. And this energizes the base and makes the base feel that finally things are changing. Okay. Now, obviously, you may have your favorite populist in mind, and so maybe you might have been able to see how this would apply, but it shouldn't be so complicated to connect what I have been saying with a lot of what Trump has done, and how this would allow us to perhaps classify him as quintessential political populist. Now, let me say a problem with the analysis. Let me skip this part because we are not going to have the time to discuss this. But let me talk about perhaps the limitation with the analogy. In many ways, a lot of people correctly like to make a distinction between left versus right-wing populism. This is what we might call the host ideology of populism, that it does make a difference whether you are right-wing or left-wing. And my sugar-fat salt analogy may not help us with this. So let's leave that analogy for now, and let's focus a little bit on this left versus right-wing populism. At the risk of being too reductionist, here's one way that we can understand some of the differences. I'm going to talk first about the left and then about the right. Left-wing populists are obsessed with inequality. Right-wing populists tend to be obsessed with security, the security of the nation or of the community or the tribe. The left with distribution. Now, this is what goes, what forms part of the sugar. On the left, there's a lot of distributionism, taxing, maybe going to extremes as to nationalizing property. The right can also go to extremes with this, but they have this different focus. And individuals have preferences here, and this is a very important difference. So we're never going to see a right-wing populist necessarily doing a lot of distributionism. They're going to be doing things like Blue Lives Matters or security spending. Let me now show you this distinction of left versus right, comparing Venezuela under Hugo Chávez and the United States. Let me just skip this for a second. Here's a picture of, in the late 2000s, Latin America was governed by a great number of left-wing populists, and not all of them are here, but we have some good ones. This is from Ecuador, and here's the famous Hugo Chávez. They're meeting with back then President of Argentina, Néstor Kirchner. Here's Lula from Brazil, Evo Morales, and this is in the late 2000s. I'm going to talk a little bit about, just skip this for a second, hold on. Hugo Chávez, this is the part of the Hugo Chávez administration. He ran from 1999 to about 2013. This is Venezuela under Hugo Chávez. At some point, a very high level of poverty, and he brings it down to 27. And a lot of people were just mesmerized by this. So this is Chávez's sugar, what made him very popular at home and abroad. I haven't talked about the salt and I haven't talked about the fat, but there is the sugar. Let me show you now. Trump is not going to do this, of course, because this is not typical. But here is from the United States defense spending. And take a look at Trump. Clearly, prior to the pandemic, he wanted to make his mark. He's not the one who increased it the most, but at least you can compare the two presidents in terms of their priorities. So we see this under Trump, and for many folks, this is an important aspect of populism. So there's this important difference, and it produces a huge ideological debate depending on where you stand as to where you think is a priority. Now, let's talk a little bit about the SALT. And one of the things that differs here. In left-wing populism, the SALT, the hatred, is often directed at capitalists, bank owners, the United States. Right-wing populists have two targets: technical experts, a type of elites, and migrants. Let me skip the portion of technical experts and focus a little bit on migrants. Let me go back a few slides, because this is what's making right-wing populism now very common in Europe. Here is a chart showing all the right-wing populist parties that now exist in Europe. If they have this color, that means that they are already part of the ruling coalition, or at least, if not the dominant party, at least one of the parties. So they're big in many places, Hungary, Italy, Austria, Switzerland, Poland, Finland, Norway. And in the other countries, they are just there competing, hoping to come to office. All of them have this anti-immigrant sentiment. They connect this to security of the tribe. And this is resonating with folks everywhere. We could talk about why this is resonating in these countries, but this is now, there used to be a time when labor folks would gravitate to left-wing populists. But this era is ending, and what we're seeing is that this anti-immigrant sentiment is attracting ordinary folks more so than anything else. And many folks, of course, worry about this. They worry about this because if taken to an extreme, if the anti-immigration sentiment is taken to an extreme, let's go to the United States, for example. Let me go back here. We know that this is the beginning of proto-fascism, and taken to an extreme, this could lead to genocide, which is always based on one tribe, one ethnic tribe trying to challenge another. A lot of folks talking about the United States have wondered why we get Trump now. And this is an important chart to understand. Notice what has happened to the non-Hispanic white population of the United States from 1977 to, well, basically, let's talk about this period, which is when Trump comes in right here. You see a big decline and an expansion of the Latino population from, you just compare these two periods. And many folks will tell you this is when you're going to see precisely these folks getting mobilized, feeling threatened and insecure. And in many ways, these right-wing populists in the United States and also in Europe are mobilizing the natives, white, against immigration. And this is one of the reasons why the appeal of one of their SALT components, their anti-immigrant stand, is so huge. Let me make one more point and talk about the connection with evangelicals. Let me first show you this picture here. Here, this is a nice collection of some of our populists of the time. Here you have right-wing and left-wing populism. Don't pay attention to that much about Duterte. Look at that finger. It's so vulgar, but that's part of his appeal. He's very, very frequently vulgar. But here we have right-wing and left-wing populists are combined. But one thing that, let me show you this picture of the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, meeting with Trump. He is often described as the tropical Trump because he is a type of right-wing populist. And one thing that they have in common, in addition to everything that I have mentioned, but which set them apart a little bit from European right-wing populists, is their marriage with right-wing Christianity. evangelicals in Brazil or Pentecostals in Brazil or the Christian right in the United States. And one of the things that we're seeing is that this marriage of right-wing populists and Christian rights, not so big in what we used to call Western Europe, but very big elsewhere, is a new phenomenon of right-wing populism. It's the reason why the Trump ticket came with Pence. Everybody understands what Pence is doing there. It's a symbol of this alliance. And we also see it in Brazil when Bolsonaro came to office. And it's an odd alliance because many times the top leader, Bolsonaro in Brazil, is sometimes the most anti-non-Christian character imaginable. And yet, evangelicals support them. There are many theories as to why this is happening. We observe it in Turkey with conservative Islam. We're observing it in Poland with conservative Catholicism. We're observing it in Russia with the most conservative parts of the Russian Orthodox Church. We're seeing it a lot. And we need to understand a little bit why this is. But the takeaway is that it makes these groups very difficult to defeat because they provide a very solid base of support that you cannot break necessarily by saying bad things about these politicians. It's a very, very, very close tie. Let me now go to a little bit about the conclusion. Regardless of these differences between left and right, political scientists argue that fundamentally these movements, even when they're moderate, are bad for liberal democracy because they don't believe in checks and balances and they don't believe in rights for all. They only believe in rights for some and hatred for the rest. When taken to an extreme, these movements can generate quite a bit of pain. I mentioned that the extreme version of right-wing populism is fascism, proto-fascism, maybe even genocide. But here is an extreme version of left-wing populism, which is Venezuela. Venezuela is experiencing one of the worst economic crises in the history of the world. This is based on 2018 data, and it was already one of the biggest, and the ones above it were all experiencing some form of war. Venezuela doesn't have a war, and yet it's up there. It's probably, if we were to do 2020, it would probably be around here. So left-wing populism with its attack on capitalism, taken to an extreme, destroys economy. Right-wing populism taken to an extreme destroys ethnic groups. So in their moderate version and in their extreme version, there's reason to worry about it. So to conclude, I beg you to not worry so much about the host ideology of populism, but to say, well, I prefer left-wing to right-wing populism. My key message is that you want to think in terms of we want a true committed liberal Democrat, and to think of this as a very different animal from populism, the way that healthy, natural food is real food, and food that has been manipulated with sugar, fat, and salt is junk food, addictive, but bad for you. Thank you for your attention. Let's now have a conversation.
Thank you, Javier. I have, if anybody has any questions, please type them into the either chat or Q&A. The question I have a question for you. I saw an interview the other day with Maria Ressa, who is the executive editor of Rappler, which is a Philippines online news website, and she's recently been convicted of cyber libel. And one of the things that she said was that we're witnessing the death of democracy because she says social media is now so much worse than even actually being in an actual war zone. And I was wondering if you might be able to speak about that a little bit, any element of that.
At the very beginning of the internet, we were very naive, thinking that this was going to democratize and produce a degree of accountability. But what we're seeing is that they have become battlegrounds for this place where we just assassinate people we disagree with. And what we have discovered is that presidents who are engaging in populist politics to dismiss their critics and their opponents are savvy at the use of social media to generate hate speech. So we see it everywhere, from Chávez to Putin to Trump to Bolsonaro to Duterte, is they talk about their critics the way that one would talk about their sports enemies, but even worse. And we're very worried about this because we do know that this type of discourse produces behavior that people can be brought to their worst forms of intolerance through social media or any type of discourse. So this is very worrisome now. On the other hand, we also know that some of the most important democratic triumphs continue to be organized through social media. So it's a tool that's available to both the defenders of liberal democracy as well as its enemies. But in the hands of its enemies, it's a very powerful tool, absolutely.
So we have a question, what will be the most likely way that the impasse in Venezuela will be solved?
I didn't mean to do a talk on Venezuela, but let's do a little bit of. One of the reasons that it is proving hard to bring a transition to democracy in Venezuela is that we have come to the understanding that the government is a combination of a military junta, that wouldn't be so complicated, but, and here's the problem, with a criminal syndicate. A lot of the people who are in government are participating or condoning drug trafficking and illicit mining. This is a very difficult political problem because the typical tools that we use to get them to soften their stronghold in power, such as sanctions, incentives with transitional justice, negotiations offering them some concessions, you name it, don't work. Because for them to quit power in Venezuela would mean to quit these criminal operations, and they don't want to. So they have no interest in a transition, and you cannot change it. So we're very pessimistic. I am pessimistic about Venezuela. The only signs for hope is that there is enough people in the government who are not part of this criminal syndicate and who may turn against the government. A lot of our attention should be aimed at getting those internal groups to sort of like defect, but defect not by leaving the government, but by conspiring within the government. Very hard to do. And the CIA and the Venezuelan opposition is not good at this game as how you get internal folks to conspire. But it's a hard nut to crack, yeah.
Okay, we have a comment here from Laura Reed, who is another favorite speaker here. And she says, I wonder if your table on demographics misses the issue of rising inequality.
Right. Okay. we're seeing the rise in inequality in many of the countries that are opting for populism. But so it's an important variable because a lot of our folks argue that the addiction for this type of politics occurs when you have a lot of folks who feel that they are being left behind and they want somebody with an anti-elite discourse. So with rising inequality, of course, you're going to have a surging demand for populism. But what that doesn't help us with is in determining whether they're going to choose a left-wing or a right-wing populist. They can go either way, and it's unclear. So normally political scientists need to know more about the voter other than the fact that they might be a victim of inequality to be able to make predictions as to whether they're going to vote for a left-wing candidate or a right-wing candidate, even if inequality is absolutely a driver of this. And many folks tell you, it's one theory, that if you really want to contain populism, to contain this cancer, you have to attack it at its root, and that is work on inequality.
So I think this will be our last one. John David Perez asks, could you comment about the effect of the narco states in Latin America, especially in Dominican Republic?
Karl Marx and Frederick Engels are famous for having said that the state in capitalist societies can become the executive committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. And what he was saying is that it's very easy for the state to become co-opted by capitalists. I have always believed that he overstated that point. I'm not a Marxist. But I do think that narco traffickers come very close to undermining the autonomy of the state. Presidents don't like them, and presidents fight them. But the cabinet and the bureaucracy becomes very co-opted by drug dealers. They use their wealth to bribe judges, to silence people, to tell bureaucrats to look the other way. And so it is one of the biggest curses for Latin American states and Latin American democracies. In the Dominican Republic, there is plenty of evidence that it is an important transit point of drugs coming from the Andes and Venezuela, not so much into the United States, but on the way to Central America. So the Dominican Republic is very much in this traffic and very susceptible to this type of influence. If I were the president of the DR, I am sure that I would have to spend a lot of my time thinking first about how to stop these folks, but also how to make sure that my own government does not become co-opted by these actors. It is a very, very difficult challenge, and I wish we had good answers for this. It has got to be one of the toughest challenges to democracy in the region.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to wrap this up here. It was delightful to see you again. Again, one of our favorite speakers. We have one more program coming up in a week, a sort of informal conversation with a former visitor through the State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program from Zambia, who after visiting with us in March of 2018 and several other nonprofits and other organizations around the country, went on to found a new organization for children with disabilities and their parents. If you're on our email list, then you will be receiving more information about that tomorrow. But thank you all for participating. Thank you, Javier. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.